For decades now, we've been told the biggest questions of how life and our universe came to be were settled. But what if they're not?
The scientific discoveries of the last 100 years, and right up to the present, are pointing in a very different direction than people thought in the late 19th century.
Stephen Meyer has spent his career digging into the deepest mysteries of our existence.
Natural selection does a nice job of explaining that small-scale variation, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining the origin of what biologists call morphological innovation, the origin of major new body plans or new form, new organs, new tissues, but especially new body plans in the history of life.
What if modern biology textbooks leave out the most important part of the story?
Darwinian evolution functions as a kind of secular religion. Mm-hmm. The question of the origin of the first life itself, how do you get life going? Right. That's something Darwin never addressed.
Right. Meyer is a New York Times best-selling author and founder of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. Now in a new film, The Story of Everything, coming to theaters April 30th, he lays out a case that could reshape how we think about life itself. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Stephen Meyer, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
It's great to be with you, Jan. Thank you for inviting me in such a beautiful studio as well.
You know, I have to offer you huge congratulations on The Story of Everything. It's a beautiful, marvelous film, and I hope it does incredibly well. And at the outset, I'll recommend everybody go see it. But let's start here, okay? Back when I was studying biology in my undergraduate degree, third year biology, something occurred to me. And that was that people would say, I believe in evolution. And I realized as I was studying evolution and continued to study evolutionary biology that when people said that, they meant different things, okay? And so, for example, what I first thought people were saying was that evolution by natural selection, this kind of specific Darwinian mechanism, happens, right? Which I think is true as a concept, right? Like this, you can see it in viruses, for example.
Indisputably
right?
True.
Exactly, indisputably true. However, what struck me was that when people say that, often they would really mean, I believe that that's where humans come from. There was this kind of quasi-religious belief in it, right? Which was just odd to me because it was very obvious to me that there were all these different, clearly there would have to be all these different mechanisms at play to get the diversity of life. It's like we've been arguing almost at cross purposes around this question. That's where I want to start.
Yeah, that's a great place to start because there's a great deal of equivocation around the term evolution. It can mean many different things. And just initial observation or reaction to what you've said is that there's a huge difference between the idea that natural selection is a real process that takes place and the claim that natural selection acting on random variations and mutations has unlimited creative power. It can be a process that is a real part of biological phenomena without necessarily having unlimited creative power. And many leading evolutionary biologists today are now calling for a new theory of evolution because they recognize that the mutation natural selection mechanism has limited creative power, quite limited creative power. I attended a conference in 2016, now 10 years ago, at the Royal Society in London that was convened by a group of biologists and evolutionary biologists who have been calling for a new theory of evolution precisely because they realize that the mechanism of mutation and selection has such limited power that it does a nice job of explaining small-scale variation and adaptation, all the classic examples that we learn about in the biology textbooks, the same ones that are repeated over and over again. There's a fairly limited number of these, but the peppered moths that change coloration from dark to light and dark again, or maybe it's the other way around, the Galapagos finches with the beaks that get a little bigger, a little smaller, and change shape in response to varying food supplies and weather patterns, antibiotic resistance, and so forth. Natural selection does a nice job of explaining that small-scale variation, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining the origin of what biologists call morphological innovation, the origin of major new body plans or new form, new organs, new tissues, but especially new body plans in the history of life. That We find again and again in the fossil record that kind of morphological innovation occurs very abruptly, and the mechanism of natural selection does not explain that well, runs out of capability very quickly. So we can talk more about why that's the case, but the distinction between just the fact of a mechanism that does something and the claim that it can do everything is often overlooked, that distinction.
So, back in that same class that I was taking, there was a man who became my friend. Actually, we thought of us as kids then, I guess, but Dennis Venema, he had the audacity to do we all had to do a seminar as part of this seminar series, right? And so he had the audacity in front of a group of people who were definitely, committed to to evolution, okay, to do a seminar on flaws in evolutionary theory, okay, and he was an evangelical Christian. Later, actually became part of this BioLogos group, which is
quite committed now to the adequacy of evolutionary theory and to the creative power of natural selection. So
actually let's do this, because I even think that maybe there's viewers out there who hear about this natural selection evolution, you might not even understand the exact mechanism. So let's just kind of define what it is very quickly, and how, and if I'm wrong, you tell me, right? But I just don't think you ever get an eye through natural selection.
Well, natural selection is the idea that the Darwinian process as a whole envisions differential reproduction, that there would be organisms that would reproduce, leave offspring with varying traits, that some of those traits would be more favored in a competition for survival, and that those would be differentially, or on a statistical basis, passed on more frequently than those traits that are not as advantageous. And over time, the idea is that there would be an accumulation of the more favorable traits, and that the differences that are represented by those genetic or mutational variations that arise in a population would eventually become fixed in the population, and there would be an overall directional change to the organism. So something fundamentally new would arise.
But let's talk about I'll just use quickly to reframe with this example, right? Yeah. The Darwin's finch. Okay, the reason you get a finch that has a very, very long beak is because there's some kind of food out there that a long beak can get.
Yeah, there's been a study of this by a couple called the Grants, and they showed that there were variations in the weather patterns in the Galapagos, and that part of that it resulted in I think there was a series of droughts, and so that there were only very hard nuts left, and so that the finches that survived better were on average had a 5% longer, or forgetting the exact figure, beak that enabled them to crack through the nuts. And so you got a small scale variation or adaptation of the structure of the beak to permit more effective Galapagos finch foraging.
But the bottom line is the ones that have the longer beaks in this case survive more often, which is why over time you get a longer and longer beak. Basically, that's the process, right?
Well, that's the claim that process can go on in an unlimited way, producing all forms of life that we see.
But how do you get an eye with that?
Let's go more fundamental. The eye, like everything else in the body, depends upon the function of large biomacromolecules called proteins. Proteins do all the important jobs in the cells. They catalyze reactions. They at very fast rates that would not otherwise occur. They build the structural parts of miniature machines. They help process information. And they're part of in the case of the eye, part of what's called a biosynthetic pathway, the vision cascade, that allows vision, even to get a light-sensitive spot, you have to have a whole series of proteins that are interacting with each other in a kind of chain to make light sensitivity possible. And so if we want to explain the origin of anything novel in life, we have to explain the origin of proteins. Now, we know proteins are built by reference to the information that's stored on the DNA molecule. And that information is stored in essentially a digital form. There's a 4-character digital code of little subunits along the spine of the DNA molecule that function like alphabetic characters in a written text or the zeros and ones in a section of software. Now we know something from our experience of software, and that is that if you start to change the zeros and ones in a section of software for doing something specific, for a specific app or a program or an operating system, and you start to change them very much, you will degrade the function of the code so that the app or the program or the operating system will no longer work long before you will have made enough changes to produce something fundamentally new. Okay, so when I ask in talks, I ask if there are computer programmers there, I'll ask if you start changing zeros and ones in a section of functioning code, are you going to build something new first, or will you degrade what you have first? And they laugh. The answer's obvious. Well, it turns out we've learned the same thing is true of the digital code in the DNA that makes the protein molecules. You can alter it a little bit, and if you do, you can sometimes alter the function of the existing protein, provided you don't change the overall structure of the protein that's called a fold. The fold makes possible sometimes multiple functions that are related, but within that structure. But as you accumulate random mutations, and usually between 3 and 5, maybe up to 7%, I mean, maybe it's even 10%, but a very small number of mutations in various proteins will cause the structural stability of that fold that makes protein function possible at all to simply degrade. There's a loss of what's called thermodynamic and structural stability. The thing unravels. Mm-hmm. But we've also learned that to build a new fold capable of a completely novel set of functions, you have to, the sequence differences between them are on the order of 65 and sometimes as much as 80%. So the same thing holds in the gene protein world that holds in the computer science world, that if you start randomly changing things at the genetic level, that's what a mutation is. As those accumulate, you're going to inevitably degrade and destroy the possibility of function in what you have long before you will have changed it enough to produce something fundamentally new that will create genetic and morphological novelty. So that's the problem, and that applies not only to the origin of the eye, because the eye depends on all these proteins in what's called the vision cascade, but it applies to virtually every significant biological change that you could imagine. So this is one of a legion of, or at least let's call it a suite of fundamental problems with the idea that the mutation selection mechanism is fundamentally creative. It's a real process. People like me who hold to the theory of intelligent design affirm that it's a real process. It's part of what we know about how biology works, but it has very limited creative power.
Stephen, one moment. We're going to take a quick break, and folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with Stephen Meyer. We're talking about the film The Story of Everything, which is a film adaptation of his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. You know, one of the key arguments you make in The Story of Everything, which I think you developed, you know, it's absolutely fascinating that the scientific discoveries that we've made in the realm of exactly the kinds of things that you talk about actually have given us a lot of information we didn't have that might have made us overlook that, you know, creative power that's somehow, you know, in the system, but isn't explained by the random mutation.
Exactly. It's the advance of science that has made us more confident that there is a designing intelligence behind life in the universe. We don't deal a great deal with the question of biological evolution in the film. We talk a bit about the miniature machines that are present inside cells and how difficult they are to explain by a step-by-step gradual Darwinian process of natural selection. We look particularly at two machines that I think are really fascinating. One is the bacterial flagellar motor that our colleague Michael Behe has made famous, and the other is the ATP synthase, which is a little turbine. So one's a rotary engine, the other is a turbine, and they're inside cells. This is, you know, that we used to, in the 19th century, as you were saying, or alluding to, the view was, right after Darwin published The Origin, that the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. That's a favorite quote of mine from Thomas Henry Huxley. I like it because he was one of the great scientists in the 19th century, and it now seems so ignorant to us. Because as we've opened up the cell, we found this exquisite realm of digital nanotechnology. And if you look at these machines, they're made of multiple protein parts, and if you have some even a large set of those, but not the totality of the parts, then you get no function. Natural selection selects for functional advantage. If the intermediate structures on the way to an eye or on the way to a flagellar motor or an ATP synthase confer no function, then there's nothing there to be preserved and passed on by the process of natural selection, and the evolutionary process will terminate before the system ever gets built. So we do have a bit in the film about that. It is a critique of biological evolution, but the film's much more concerned with the question of the origin of the first life itself. How do you get life going?
Right.
That's something Darwin never addressed.
Right. Let's go back to third-year university Jan.
Yeah,
right?
sure, okay.
It was a very strange thing for me because it became very clear to me that evolution by natural selection wasn't the only mode, right? This is actually what my work became, looking at alternate models of evolution, because I still am perplexed in a way, unless we're really just talking about ideology, right? Why?
And that's very cutting edge, because
Right.
that's where the field has gone. People are saying we need a new theory. There's got to be some other mechanism that provides the creative impulse or the creative power that mutation and selection doesn't provide. What did you find in your studies?
Well, no, I mean, I had basically started a PhD, ended up finishing it as a master's. My life got kind of thrown a massive curveball, if you will.
Sure.
But no, I was looking at the hybridization between two species of lemur, actually.
Okay.
And just because I was curious, I had heard about this particular unusual situation in this one reserve in Madagascar, where it looked like two species were coming into one, right? And I was just interested in, again, alternate models, and I was like, oh, this looks exciting.
Yeah.
And I get to go to Madagascar.
Yeah.
You know?
I think there was a film about Madagascar with lots of lemurs.
Well, there was, and in fact, nobody understood what I studied until that film.
Until the cartoon
we needed
came out.
to see the cartoon, and then everybody knew. Yeah, exactly. But this is, what I came to, right? And I think when a lot of people say, I believe in evolution, right? What they're saying is that human beings are meat, or human beings are meat computers, or something like that, right? Like, it's just we're not the product. There's no kind of divine inspiration here. We're not made in the image of God, as certain faiths would describe Christianity notably, and others, and there isn't that significance,
Well, this gets back to that meaning of evolution. There are three basic meanings of evolution. Mm-hmm. One is that there's been change over time, and that can refer to small-scale adaptation, like the Galapagos finches or the peppered moths, or it can refer to the idea that life on the planet now is different than it was a long time ago. So if we look in the fossil record, we no longer have trilobites or triceratopses. So the composition of life on the planet is different than it was as recorded in the fossil record a long time ago. So that meaning of evolution, I think, is pretty much indisputable. But then there's a second meaning of evolution. It's the idea that there's been continuous change over time, such that the best way to represent the history of life is a great branching tree, where the base of the tree is represented by one or very few simple, presumably one-celled organisms, and that we've had a kind of continuous and gradual morphing and changing of those very simple forms into all the forms we see today, but everything is related by common ancestry. That's a more controversial meaning, but then the most controversial meaning is the third meaning. Not that and that has to do with the action of mutation and natural selection, but not just the idea that the process occurs, but rather that it has sufficient creative power to explain all of the change implied by that tree of life picture of the history of life, and also the appearance of design that living organisms manifest. So a big part of the idea of Darwinism, of Darwinian evolution, was the idea that there is this unguided, undirected process that can account for the appearance of design without the process having been designed or directed in any way. So it's inherently materialistic. And that's where then it helps to underwrite a larger materialistic worldview. Richard Dawkins has famously said Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Well, why? Because he's given account of the appearance of design without there being a designer. An undirected process is doing all the creative work.
I mean, this has been quite some time in the making for you. I mean, you've written quite a number of books, that kind of all point in this direction, right? And now it's the story of everything.
Everything. Well, it's a bit of we admit it's a little bit pretentious title, but it's literally true. We're talking about the universe, right? Mm-hmm. It's the story of where the universe came from, where its finely tuned structure came from, how that arose, and then how life arose within the universe. And those are the three big questions we look at. And in each case, the scientific discoveries of the last 100 years and right up to the present are pointing in a very different direction than people thought in the late 19th century. Not towards the idea of a self-existing, self-creating, self-organizing universe that can account for everything as a consequence of slow, gradual, undirected processes, but rather something that bears the hallmarks of a mind, and information is a hallmark of mind. That kind of tight functional integration that we see in circuits or in the eye. If we find the kinds of features that we find in living systems or in the fine-tuning of the universe in any other realm of experience, we would immediately conclude that they were the product of a creative intelligence. And yet we're finding them in parts of nature that we know we did not create. So that implies that there was a creative intelligence that preceded us.
Well, Stephen Meyer, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
It's been a great conversation, Jan. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining Stephen Meyer and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.
Has the universe always been here, or is it finite?
Here is evidence for what can only be described as a supernatural event.
The universe, it bears everywhere the fingerprints of its creator.
And surprisingly, it is science that has revealed this.
We're dealing with a system of manifold, complex design.
The concept of life as a cosmic phenomenon should have many consequences. The question then was, what does one do about it?